Good afternoon. Glad to have everybody back for this afternoon's session of the third annual Glenn Symposium. My name is Alan DeLuna. I'm president of the American Astronautical Society, and we hope that y'all enjoyed the morning sessions. I wish we had a few more hours for the morning. There's a lot of information that was given forth, tremendous amount of content. And I wish we had more hours of this afternoon because you guys are going to be really surprised by some of the things that you hear. I would like to thank our sponsors for this session, Aerojet Rocketdyne, Maxar, and Moog, or some people say Moog, and I say one thing one time and one thing the next time, so I never know what I'm going to do. But to think about living off the grid, one of my favorite TV programs is building off the grid, seeing how people take care of things when they don't have the resources and utilities that we have nowadays, and they have to go off and do it all self-provided. Well, our next session is surface power. Did someone bring a charger? And this is really living off the grid, and we're talking about Moon and Mars. Now to introduce this panel, I'll turn it over to our moderator, Walt England. He's the Deputy Associate Administrator for the Space Technology Mission Directorate of NASA. Walt, take it away with your panel.
Hey, thanks, Alan. Thank you and the AAS and the Glenn Research Center and everybody involved in making this Glenn Symposium so successful, even though we're in a virtual environment. I'll also thank the session sponsors, Aerospace Corporation, Maxar, and Moog. And especially thanks to everybody out there participating and viewing online. I'm hopeful we can all be together and in person and see each other again soon. So what we have promises to be a really exciting and dynamic panel this afternoon, focused on lunar surface power. We've got representatives from NASA and some of our key industry participants to talk about lunar power architectures, lunar technologies and systems. And NASA's plans to return to the moon with the Artemis program includes a long-term sustainable architecture component that will absolutely require advancements in power generation, storage, and distribution technologies. NASA's Space Technology Mission Directorate, where I actually hail from, is investing heavily in advanced power system technologies for lunar surface infrastructure and with an eye towards Mars missions in the future. And we have over a dozen active projects in our game-changing development program portfolio, specifically focused on power generation, deployable surface tower arrays, advanced fuel cells, and power control and distribution, several of which you'll probably hear about today. So all of these with the goal of allowing systems to operate and survive in the harsh and extreme environments of the lunar surface during daylight, the frigid night, and the permanently shadowed regions. So some of you may have heard, I hope you got to hear Jim Ryder, the Associate Administrator for Space Technology Mission Directorate, who gave the keynote yesterday. He mentioned several of these technologies in his keynote, and he mentioned our partnership with the Department of Energy to develop and mature a fission surface power system for use on the Moon and Mars. The fission surface power system project is based there at Glenn Research Center, and Jim mentioned yesterday that we're finalizing a request for proposals that will go out later this fall to solicit preliminary designs for a 10 kilowatt class fission power system that NASA could demonstrate on the lunar surface. So we're excited about that and look forward to some exciting proposals from the industry. And finally, I'd like to put in a plug for a power beaming workshop that's being hosted by the Lunar Surface Innovation Consortium, which the Applied Physics Laboratory runs for us here in STMD. They're hosting a public workshop that will take place virtually on July 22nd and 23rd. Details for that can be found on the Lunar Surface Innovation Consortium webpage at lsic.jhuapl.edu. So hopefully we'll see some of you there. So with that, I'd like to turn to our panel and have them share with you some of the details, both from a NASA and an industry perspective of power systems and architectures for the return to the lunar surface and with an eye towards Mars. So I'd like to go ahead and introduce them one at a time and give them a few minutes to share some of their own thoughts, and then we'll open it up to some Q&A. I'll just say each of our panel members this afternoon have deep subject matter expertise and a lengthy career list of achievements it would take me probably the rest of the session to read them all to you. So I'm going to give a sort of a brief intro, and I'll invite you to look at their program bios to see their extensive list of accomplishments. So I'd like to start with introducing my colleague here at NASA headquarters, Mr. Doug Craig. Doug is the Strategic Analysis and Planning Manager for the Human Exploration Operations Mission Directorate, or HEOMD. And he develops human exploration architectures, including Artemis, and will share some of the most current details and plans for the sustainable lunar architecture that will drive requirements for power systems from a NASA perspective. So Doug, let me turn it over to you.
Okay, thanks, Walt. So what I'm going to cover with you today is kind of the overview of the Artemis Base Camp, and highlighting specific power architecture needs, then go into some of the challenges that we have, and one of a potential solution for it. Then we'll go to questions. So if you go to the next chart. So just to remind everybody where the Artemis strategy came from, is basically it was developed with these three human exploration objectives as the foundation. The first is to send the first woman and first person of color to the lunar surface and return them to Earth, establish a sustained human lunar presence on the moon by the end of the decade, and then leverage those lunar missions to prepare for Mars missions in the 2030s. So to do that, we've come up with, if you go to the next chart, an Artemis Base Camp concept that will be at the lunar South Pole. And what we want to do is to be able to support a crew of 4 for 30 days on the lunar surface doing exploration and science activities. So what I'll do is I'll go through each of these elements just to give you an idea of what the Artemis Base Camp consists of. So the first is, of course, on the left, the human landing system. Land the 2 to 4 crew down to the surface. They'll get out in their EVA suits. Shortly after the first mission, we're looking at putting a lunar terrain vehicle down. That's basically an unpressurized rover that will allow the crew to extend their range of exploration and science objectives. And then also importantly is that when the crew is not there, the LTV will be able to be used via teleoperation from Earth the other 11 months of the year for doing science and exploration activities. The next element down would be the habitable mobility platform. Is basically a pressurized rover that will provide the habitation capability for 2 crew for 30 days. It'll also extend the range along with the lunar terrain vehicle to explore even farther areas. It will also provide the ability to protect the crew from dust as well. We have the foundation surface hab, and that'll be landed. That will also provide the ability to house 2 crew for 30 days. So when you combine the surface hab and the mobility platform, you now have the ability for 30-day missions with 4 crew on the surface. Now, in addition to that, as Walt said, we're looking at a fission surface power to help provide the power for these systems. And one of the questions we have is, what is how much self-sustained power generation and storage do these systems have? And that's an ongoing study as we speak. We're also looking at communications, navigation, and other power systems, and ISRU on the surface. So to give you an idea of what what the energy requirements are, if you look at the lunar terrain vehicle, it'll require about 1 kilowatt of power, a little bit less than that. The pressurized rover will require somewhere around 12 to 15 kilowatts of power. And then the foundation surface hab will require about 10 kilowatts of power. Now, to make sure that all of these systems can operate together, an important factor that we're studying right now is standard interfaces, so that, for instance, the power recharge capabilities are common across all of these systems, so that they can leverage each other as required by either normal operations or contingency operations. So if you go to the next chart, so while the base camp is important, it is the base camp, and we want to be able to perform exploration activities going further away from that base camp. And we're working with the Science Mission Directorate now to identify key targets, key areas of scientific interest that we would like to travel to explore. You can see on this chart the scale of Shackleton Crater. Basically, the Washington D.C. can fit into the crater about it, and so you can see that really need to have the mobility of the pressurized rover and the lunar terrain vehicle to be able to explore the areas that we would like to go explore, the different craters and different permanently shadowed regions. So if you go to the next chart, so some other challenges that we have are the lighting and shadowing. And so the South Pole is a great location for lunar, solar availability, solar light availability for power generation. But it does have some issues with the low angle lightings that can create shadows from either terrain or like the landers. And so what we want to do is we're analyzing to see how much shadow time or eclipse time we need to be able to plan for so that the elements can survive, whether it be 5 days, 8 days, or maybe even up to 14 days of shadow period. So that's in the trade space too right now, is what we're looking at, different locations on the lunar surface and identifying kind of what the lighting requirements are going to be. So if you go to the next chart, one of the questions that we had, if you look at the ranges of exploring on the chart with the head with Shackleton Crater, one concept of extending the range of the rovers is to set down kind of a recharge station, kind of like similar to the recharge stations we have here on Earth for the electric vehicles. And we were calling those the portable utility pallets. And so basically this would provide the ability to have the rovers go up to it, recharge, and then continue their exploration. In addition to providing the power, they'd also provide communications capability, and this would extend the range of the rovers. Additionally, we could also bring those back to or land some close to the base and use them as required. So that's kind of the lunar surface power architecture at a very high view. And I guess I'll turn it over back to Walt.
All right. Hey, thanks, Doug. Next up, I'd like to invite Mr. Joe Cassidy to share with us some of his thoughts. He is the Executive Director for Space Programs for Aerojet Rocketdyne and Washington, D.C. operations. Joe oversees strategy development and architectures for future space launch systems. He's led flight projects for the Essex Arcjet system, which still holds the record as the highest power electric propulsion system flown, EO-1 pulse plasma thruster system, and has served on a number of advisory groups for both NASA and the DoD. So, Joe, over to you.
Thank you, Walt. So I thought the first question I'd address right away on the first chart is why does Aerojet Rocketdyne know anything about power? So I wanted to just clear that up right away. That little rectangle that you see there in red outlined is the pallet on the space station truss that houses all the power system. And that was something that actually Rocketdyne was responsible for. And as part of putting the companies Aerojet and Rocketdyne together, we have come to have that capability in-house and still do have that. So we'll go on to the next chart. I'll talk a little bit about that history. So this is just a little bit about our heritage and the things we've worked in across the many legacy companies that are now part of Aerojet Rocketdyne. And I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but I'll just point out a couple of key areas. One, as you know, Walt mentioned early on, now that we're again looking at fission power for space, that is something that we have a lot of experience in, going back to the SNAP programs in the 1960s. We've also developed quite a capability over the years to do system analysis of both nuclear thermal and nuclear electric systems, as well as along the way developing the power systems using RTGs that are now used by both Curiosity and Perseverance on the surface of Mars. At the same time, our interest in power has taken us in some other directions. Because we've done those power systems, as I mentioned, on the space station, we've taken that heritage and legacy. We upgraded the batteries, for instance, for Boeing on the space station, and went away from the nickel hydrogen batteries to the new lithium ion batteries that are just now, I think, completing being installed on the station today, or in this time frame. And then we've also been working with several of the current commercial folks, including Sierra Space on the Dream Chaser. So we cover kind of the gamut in power systems. We're very interested in looking at them for both surface applications as well as in-space power. And I'm very interested, Walt, in that surface power beaming workshop that you mentioned, because that's another area that we've looked at in the past. Go to the next chart. So just a little bit about the space station power system. I think most folks are pretty much aware of it. It's been up there a while now, over, I think it's 19 years now. This chart's probably a little bit out of date. Was set up to provide 100 kilowatt continuous capability. Basically had really a peak generation power capability of about 260 kilowatts of power. Took into account that there would be some degradation over life. And with the new installed lithium ion batteries, about 421 kilowatt hours of energy storage. There's also a 160 volt primary bus and 120 volt secondary power bus. So this is quite a power system, and something that we feel we can leverage in looking at designs for both surface and in-space power. Next chart, please. I mentioned Dream Chaser. So some of the stuff that we've been working on more recently, currently with Sierra Space, are the power distribution, energy storage, and power conversion systems for the Dream Chaser. We've also done, and this is important, I know Doug mentioned, I think in his discussion about interfaces, one of the things we've looked at is power interconnects between systems and making sure that you have that compatibility when you're docking between systems that may be provided by multiple different providers. So that's something else that we've been able to work over the years, looking at these designs for things ranging from Dream Chaser to the Orion crew vehicle. Next chart, please. And I couldn't do this presentation without mentioning Mars, a particular favorite of mine. So I did say earlier that we had that work with the RTGs, actually started the program for NASA and DOE as the multi-mission radioisotope thermal generator, or MMRTG. And we're very pleased when it was selected and flown on the Curiosity rover. It's now been up there and operating very successfully on Curiosity since 2008 timeframe. And then Perseverance is now coming up on just a little over a year, or 1.5 Earth years since middle of 2019. So very happy to say we've got 2 power systems successfully operating on Mars. And we had the, I think the experience that we saw when with Curiosity, there was a global dust storm. We saw what these kind of power systems really can mean, because Curiosity was able to keep going through that dust storm when Opportunity rover, which was solar array powered, basically was disabled by the solar opacity of the Martian atmosphere during that dust storm and wasn't able to recover. So, and we're seeing the same kind of things now with the InSight lander. So, dust is going to be a consideration when you look at power systems, and that's one of the things that we've seen already on Mars. Next. So looking at lunar surface power systems and considerations, we just put this little timeline together to try to say, looking at what Doug was showing there as the NASA vision, and then thinking from that outpost and beyond, what would be some of the types of technologies that make sense. So really starting from the near term on the left-hand side there, we're looking at the South Polar region, shorter stay times, maybe lower power requirements initially. The kinds of things that we're looking at could build off of the solar array powered systems, take advantage of the lithium-ion batteries, potentially fuel cells. As you go to longer stays and you need to be able to survive the lunar night, we're thinking of things like potentially the tower type arrays, maybe some kind of a concentrator or reflective system. Then you start looking at energy storage concepts beyond batteries, maybe regenerative fuel cells come into play. And as we go to the more ambitious missions, as Doug was saying there with the rovers and the HABs, where you have multiple vehicles or systems that require 10 kilowatts or so power, then you really do start looking at the fission surface power as a primary power source. And maybe you can look at things like the power stations that Doug mentioned for recharging the rovers in a remote sense. Then you have the other problem, which is how do you hook it all together? And you have to really look at things like power transmission over much larger distances than even what we had to deal with on the space station coming down the booms there. So we're looking at probably like a kilometer type distances on the moon from the power source to the power utilizer or user. And so that's where we're looking at the different types of transmission systems, whether that be AC power, or potentially even looking at things where we have a centralized power station with power beaming to be able to recharge something at a distance or continue to supply power at a distance. Also, in terms of the power management distribution, considering things like the radiation tolerant PMAD, looking at things like the gallium nitride power electronics. And then, of course, the experience we've had on Mars with the radioisotope power systems, we still believe those can come into play for certain applications. They certainly have a lot of utility in the several hundred watt power range, and give you the ability to put those things in places where perhaps down deep in a crater or something where you aren't going to see sunlight. So I think I'll just wrap up with that and turn it back over to you, Walt.
Okay, hey, thanks, Joe. All right, next on our list, I'd like to introduce Dr. Christine Edwards, who's the Deputy Exploration Architect at Lockheed Martin Space, where she co-leads commercial civil space advanced programs team and architecture and technology developments for future human spaceflight missions. Her specialty is in enabling greater autonomy for future space exploration missions through advances in AI and human machine teaming. So Christine, over to you.
Hello, thank you. So I'm the Deputy Exploration Architect at Lockheed Martin Space, and my team looks at the kinds of missions that NASA, industry, and our international partners want to perform in the future. And we develop concepts and early system designs that could help accomplish those missions. One of our projects has been architecting lunar power infrastructure. The questions we are investigating are, what are the missions that the scientific, governmental, and commercial communities want to do? What are their power needs? What combination of systems and technologies can achieve those needs? And how can those capabilities extend to Mars missions? We have been assessing potential growth in power and resource needs as the lunar economy grows, and exploring the modularity and adaptability of systems like Lockheed Martin's Lunar Vertical Solar Array technology, the VSAT, that can enable the growth of lunar power infrastructure. Next slide, please. As a systems architect, I try to envision how various systems can come together as a whole to meet mission needs, to help enable the space community's visions for Artemis. Here's a figure that shows the buildup of some of the initial capabilities planned for Artemis, including the unpressurized Lunar Terrain Vehicle, LTV, a pressurized rover, a surface habitat, power elements, including the VSAT and Vision surface power elements, and an ISRU pilot plant. After the first landing on the moon for Artemis, each subsequent landing can build additional capability. Like VSAT can start with providing supplemental power for the rovers and enabling for crew habitation. And then later, fission surface power provides additional power that is steady through the lunar nights. You can go to the next slide. For the initial phase of Artemis that will emphasize exploration and mobility, those early missions will likely go to several locations around the lunar South Pole region to perform scientific investigations and to scout out the best location for a more permanent base. That mobile architecture will include more mobile elements like the unpressurized and pressurized rovers and robotics. This architecture could be designed to adapt from supporting the initial mobile phase to a phase that emphasizes the sustained presence in Mars mission support. For example, initial power systems can provide supplemental power to mobile systems for exploration missions to those various locations. Then they can form part of the Artemis base after its site is selected and deliver power to other elements through a microgrid hub. And it can adapt to incorporate new technologies like power beaming into craters. As the infrastructure builds, the various elements could be modular and interoperable. Next slide. As this infrastructure grows, so do its power needs. These graphs show estimates on how much power these surface elements could need over time and how much power supply there could be with the current plans. Rovers could use an external power source for some of their battery charging needs. Habitation power needs can grow with additional habitation elements and payload deliveries. And ISRU can begin with a low-level power draw when it's just a pilot plant, then ramp up with the delivery of a full ISRU plant. The amount of ISRU material that can be produced will be limited by the amount of power available. And our Lockheed Martin team has been developing and advocating that ISRU will fuel lunar economics, especially a water-based economy that provides fuel and consumables to various missions. For example, our Mars Base Camp mission concept is a spacecraft that would transport crew between the gateway at the moon and Mars, starting with using propellant from Earth and transitioning to using propellant delivered from ISRU production on the moon. The ISRU demands for this kind of mission would fuel a nascent lunar economy and grow over time. For the power supply timeline on the right, we have a fission surface power demo and solar array elements. This assessment showed that 2 VSAT elements and the fission surface power demo could meet initial power demand. And as habitation and ISRU power needs grow, an operational fission surface power element can help meet that demand while also testing that technology for Mars. Diversity and adaptability of systems will be key as we go forward, such as not just using the solar array and fission that I show here, but also various batteries, fuel cells, and distribution systems that can grow and handle varied systems and loads as new users arrive at the base. Next slide. These are exciting times to be living in and contributing to the Artemis era of space exploration. Thank you for listening to my presentation.
Hey, thank you, Christine. Okay, rounding out our panel this afternoon, Mike Provenzano, who is the Director of Planetary Mobility at Astrobotic. Mike is responsible for leading development of Astrobotic's planetary rover and power infrastructure technologies. He leads a team of professionals developing commercial lunar rovers and in the first space-based wireless charging system. So Mike, over to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Walt. Yeah, and it's a pleasure to be here today to talk among all the awesome panelists here. I'm going to share a little bit more about Astrobotic, specifically our power services. Walt, you can go to the next slide. So I kept it pretty short. Was hoping that we could get into some discussion on the panel side. I only have 2 slides, but really the first slide is really just to showcase that Astrobotic is involved in a lot of different technologies right now. We build landers, which is primarily what we're known for, but we also have a lot of software and sensing technologies that we use to improve the reliability of our landers and plan our missions ahead of time. And we also have a lot of rover and power assets that we plan to deploy in upcoming missions. So starting at the top, we have our Peregrine mission, which is going to be flying next year. We're really excited about it. And NASA is one of the customers that we're flying to the moon. They're our largest customer as well, but there's a lot of international countries aboard. We have our Griffin lander, which is going to be flying the NASA's Viper rover in 2023 to the moon to look for water ice and drill and ultimately send that information back to Earth. We have our precision landing systems, our terrain relative navigation, which is integrated with our landers that we're using on our first mission. It was developed with STMD under the Tipping Point contract. And then we have mission simulation tools, which we use to help us accurately land and plan out where we're going to land. We also use it for our own rover techniques as well, so we can determine where to be, how we will plan our routes out for when we drive, as well as most recently, where we would like to deploy our VSAT. So then now the group I run the Planetary Mobility Division, as Walt noted, and that encompasses a lot of rover and power technologies. So we have our Cube rover product line, which is really just a small commercial rover that's meant to democratize and open up access to the moon for lots of users. And those rovers can carry up to 24 kilograms. And that's actually being developed under a Tipping Point program right now. And then we have our Polaris rover. It's much larger. It's about the size of a golf cart and can carry about 90 kilograms of payload capacity. We have our vertical solar array technology, which we're thrilled to be working on. That will deliver up to 10 kilowatts of power. It's essentially a 30-foot tall solar array that will provide power and form the backbone of the power grid on the moon. And then we have our wireless chargers, which are available in different sizes. We're maturing them now with a partner of ours, Wybotic. And ultimately, this is being developed under a Tipping Point contract as well. And we're going to be flight qualifying that unit very soon. So what's really cool about all these technologies is they may sound at first like they're kind of separate. They're related somehow, but actually we've found a way to put them all together in one comprehensive mission. And that's what I'll show you on this next slide, which is my last slide. And you could go ahead, Walt, perfect. So this is actually our amped infrastructure. We were really pleased to have won the grand prize for the Watts on the Moon Challenge earlier this year. And that architecture really takes into account all the things I just talked to you about. So we have our, everything can be launched on one Griffin lander to the moon, which is important as we're talking about the commercial lunar payload services missions. And everything being able to fit on one lander can be really cost effective, brings down mass complexity and whatnot. And we would intend to deploy our VSAT on that mission, which we then have a series of our small rovers, our Cube rovers that would drive out, which are cabled directly to the VSAT. and they would drive out to different locations as needed and would be affixed with wireless charging systems. So that way, other assets, like something like an excavation rover, would be able to drive up next to our deployed cube rover and just drive up next to it to receive power through wireless charging. So actually, each of these are developed as standalone systems. They all have value in their own right. But when you combine them together, you can create something that's much more powerful. And this is what we're really excited about. It's just, it's amazing to be alive in a time where we could potentially fly something like this to the moon and potentially have a power grid. So with that, I'll close and excited to talk more with the rest of the panel.
Hey, thanks, Mike, and thanks to the panel. Hey, before we open it up to general audience Q&A, I've got a couple questions of my own, and I'll just take the liberty as a moderator to ask the panel. And I'd like to pose the first one, and just it's sort of an open-ended. What do you think the role of the government should be with respect to lunar power, either as an owner-operator of systems that are commercially developed, or more as an anchor tenant and just buying services from commercial providers? So maybe what I'll do is we'll go in reverse order, and Mike, we'll start with you and ask your thoughts from the astrobotic perspective.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it's a great question, Walt. And I think as a commercial company, I'll speak to the idea that I think it's a really sustainable model if the government is one of the customers that buys services from the community. I think that in the long term, commercialization can really only be realized if NASA is just one of those customers. And I think we're seeing that now. A really good parallel is through the CLIPS program, where we're carrying payloads from different countries, different customers, and NASA is one of the customers that's helping us get to the moon. And they're one of the groups that's interested in doing science on the moon. So I think that that model has been really successful so far in the CLIPS community, and that it's enabling these businesses to develop, be innovative, and come up with these really awesome business models that tie in lots of other systems. And I think that it's encouraging because it's encouraging to small businesses because it makes us be innovative. It makes us be agile and resourceful to ensure that our products and the resulting architectures that they enable are sustainable. I think this is how we cross that chasm of just government contracting to get into the commercial line of business, so that companies start to get more engaged later on, and so that international agencies can get more involved later on. And I think that as an example, what STMD is doing is really great because they have lots of opportunities like VSAT. They have the tipping point opportunities, which are funding a lot of these technologies to be developed along the way, which is enabling businesses like Astrobotic and many other small businesses to kind of get ahead and start having these services that are allowed to be shared with the rest of the community. So I would love to see a day when NASA's just buying power services from a company, and it's just like you buy power services on Earth here.
Hey, thanks, Mike. Christine, how about the Lockheed Martin perspective?
I see government as providing an anchor tenant role, being an initial customer, providing the early demands necessary to catalyze the lunar economy. For the power example, in purchasing power for its own exploration programs, a reliable government customer could fulfill this role by demonstrating to private investors that the technical and economic feasibility of these services is there. And in this way, this customer creates a stable economic framework in which further investments and developments can occur with confidence. And given the right initial conditions, this lunar economy will develop with a competitive landscape of many suppliers supporting a wide variety of customer, government, commercial, international customers.
Okay, thanks, Christine. Joe, how about the Aerojet Rocketdyne perspective?
Oh, thanks, Walt. Yeah, I was going to say, in looking at this and in what everybody showed, you really have a whole portfolio of things that can play a role in providing an overall power infrastructure. And the one thing I was focusing in on was something like the fission surface power, though, which is really a critical enabler, not just for the moon, but for future Mars exploration. And I think in that particular case, just because it is such a jump in capability, that's going to be one where we definitely need the government to come in and be the sort of driver on that first. And I think just like Christine just said, you know, once that happens and people see that that's available and possible, it'll open up a lot of other opportunities. I certainly understand what Mike's saying, you know, for a diverse set of customers that might have, you know, small things and low power needs initially, that's a great way to go. But something like fission surface power, I just see that as being, you know, something the government is going to need to drive forward.
Hey, fair enough. Thanks, Joe, for that perspective. And Doug, any thoughts on from the HEOMD perspective?
Yeah, I kind of see it as a little bit of both, as Joe just mentioned, that there are going to be, I do see NASA as being required to be the anchor tenant, but I also see the need to allow for innovation through the service contracts. I mean, the U.S. industry alone is spending billions of dollars investing in energy storage technologies. And so in order to leverage that, I think the service, going down the service contract would be a good way to leverage those innovative ideas and innovative technologies that are coming down the future.
Okay. Hey, thanks, Doug. Hey, one more question, and then we'll open it up to the audience, and maybe we'll do this in the reverse order. So, Doug, we'll start back with you. And just why don't you share with us your thoughts on fixed-based power systems versus mobile systems? I heard a number of different architectural options from the industry friends. So, what do you think? Or is there a one or the other, or a combination of the both?
I think it's a combination. If you look at something like the Surface Hab, it's going to require, you know, kind of a fixed infrastructure. But then as we try to explore and expand the range of exploration, I do think mobile or portable energy storage systems, energy generation and storage systems will be important too.
Joe, you look like you might have had a thought you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, well, I was thinking about it as Doug said that. It fits that model that Doug showed and kind of Mike showed too, really, of the, you know, idea of a central location that you can access as sort of the primary power source, but then having the ability to expand that radius out later on. And now that I think about it, actually, Christine also had that in her architecture. So I think we're all thinking along the same lines. And so, you know, the idea that I think initially we're going to need some kind of a fixed base, but it would be really great to have the ability to do the wireless charging and expand your range with either that or like the pallet ones that Doug showed in his, where, you know, basically if you're going a certain direction, you could just drop those down in, you know, some kind of increments, 20, 50 kilometer increments out in the direction you need to go, and you drive to them and charge, not unlike the electric cars do here on Earth today.
Hey, thanks, Joe. Christine, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that along with the other panelists, that I think that these initial power systems, it'd be great for them to have some aspect of both the mobile and fixed architecture support incorporated into them. The more that you can reuse systems from site to site or from location to location, the more we can build infrastructure that also builds capability. So that's an argument for mobility. And but then if the power systems are adaptable, they could be used for more and more customers that arrive at the moon. And if you have a consolidated location that they're all kind of coming to together, then they can move where they're needed, or you can build that power supply over time to meet the new customer needs. And eventually, though, when we establish more of that consolidated base, fission surface power elements would likely need to be more fixed, but it would provide much more power to enable ISRU and other activities that require those higher levels of power.
And Mike, as Director of Planetary Mobility, I can guess what your answer might be, but you want to share any other thoughts?
It's true. We do like things that move. I think I agree with everybody else, though, what everybody is sharing here. I think it's a mix of both that is optimal. And the scenarios I think about are that when we go again to the moon for the first time in a long time, that we're going to be deploying, the hope is to deploy assets that are fixed in location strategically, maybe on the top of a crater rim, so that they can power other assets that can drive next to them or be near them. But I ultimately think, as Christine and everybody was touching on, is that when you want to have assets that operate, for example, in permanently shadowed regions, you're going to need something that can drive in there and can power those assets. And whether it's hooking up a cable to that asset so it can receive continuous power for something that maybe is on a crater rim, or whether it's something that is like a rover that has some power inside of it, whether it's through a cable or it's actually just got it in its batteries, can transfer that over to something like, I can imagine there's going to be mining operations, there's going to be excavation operations in these PSRs. And to allow those assets to stay in the PSRs is going to be a really good decision. So that way you can kind of continue to increase the productivity of those assets and get the most value out of them without them having to drive out of the PSR and go get a charge and sit down for a little while and then go back to it. So I definitely think both are necessary. For sure.
Okay, thanks, Mike. So let's see, Alan, I can't see any audience questions, but if we have any, we'd be happy to entertain them.
Well, there'll be a few questions, so everybody keep your cameras on. And turn on your mic when you answer. I do apologize. I had a computer crash in the middle of the session, so I missed a little bit of it. So if I ask a redundant question, please tolerate me there. But well, we've got one question. How do the power thermal considerations change targeting the South Pole compared to where the Apollo missions landed? Why are the power systems different in the South Pole than more equatorial? And let's go ahead and throw that one probably to Doug.
Well, I think what you'll find in the South Pole, it's actually the temperatures are less extreme than on the equator. And so it's actually a little bit easier for the thermal environmental control systems for the power systems.
Easier and better. Okay. Next question, then I assume we talked about nuclear power a little bit during my downtime, assuming that we did, even if we didn't. Nuclear power is certainly part of a number of people's different architectures. In fact, not just RTG, but reactors. So what kind of considerations are there for used reactor disposal or safing? What are the considerations there? And I think probably that's an architecture question that Christine has probably looked at. If I'm wrong, somebody else jump in and answer.
Yeah, I think that when you're setting up the architecture with using the nuclear power, that's some of the things that we've been looking at is placing it in locations that are safe for the crew to operate. So you'd have probably like a location where you have your nuclear elements, and then you have the locations where you have the crew operation areas, and probably put together some keep out zones to keep the crew safe in those areas. For disposal, it probably would be, I would guess, a dispose in place approach, but Joe Cassidy, I don't know if you have any other ideas on that.
I think you're right, and I think the other thing to point out is if folks aren't aware that we are looking at different fuels now, and one of the things we're looking at is the high assay, low enriched uranium as a way of getting around some of the issues with the highly enriched uranium. So yeah, but I think just basically the idea would be put them in an isolated location from the HABs and human occupied zones. And then, the long life of these things is the other thing. I mean, we're really looking at probably these things lasting, our RTGs right now on Mars are good for 20 plus years. And I'm sure these reactors are going to be built with design lives of at least that long. So it is something to consider for long-term planning. But I think what you said about just have them in a place where when we're done with them, we can leave them there and they'll be safe.
I think also to add on to that too, the way that we've been thinking about this at Astrobotic is that there's different types of mission needs. I would imagine that nuclear power is very, very useful for megawatt capabilities and things like mining, for example, that are going to and additive manufacturing in situ. Whereas things like maybe there are smaller assets, rovers, maybe you could have a really small scale outpost that could run on something like a VSAT that's solar powered. And maybe that's the early indicators as, stepping stones as we get towards those larger scale capabilities, megawatt production. But I think it's good to differentiate the two. I think they're both necessary.
Right. Yeah, Christine brought up earlier, the ISRU is a big driver too. If you really want to start cranking out propellant from the moon, that drives the rate of production really drives the power demand up quickly.
Okay, Walt, you started off with something that caught my attention and caught one or two other folks' attentions. You talked about power beaming. Why is power beaming now becoming a serious consideration as opposed to the thing of science fiction?
Well, from a architecture perspective, it's certainly interesting and useful in that you don't have to drag cables around with all your assets. And I think there's a lot of people who have given a lot of thought to the technical capability and how we might actually enable a power beaming capability and a power beaming enabled architecture. And in fact, that is the subject of the workshop I mentioned up front. So I would encourage folks who are interested to come participate. It is a workshop that's open to the public. It will be virtual, so bring your ideas and thoughts, and let's get them out on the table so we can think about a way to get them funded and make them reality.
Maybe, and also I'd like to add on to that. I think Walt made a great point about dragging cables around. For wireless power transfer, another added benefit is we worry so much about dust on the moon. Everybody talks about dust and how it becomes a hindrance if you try to mechanically mate joints together, and you could get dust in those joints and it could interfere with the mating connection. If you have means of wireless power transfer, then that becomes less of a concern, and you can have a lot of tolerance, I guess. It could be angular misalignment tolerance. It could be separation, just in terms of distance tolerance, that you don't need to worry about those kinds of things. And also, there's other solutions, like we've heard about contact charging, for example, which is really just one asset touching another asset and receiving charge through pins. But you need a lot of kind of sophisticated autonomy to enable those kinds of very precise operations to be able to dock next to like a lander or a power structure, for example, to receive that charge. And then the last thing I'd mention is that solar power is another great alternative too. You could have solar panels on assets that just generate power themselves, as opposed to getting wireless power transfer from another asset. But that adds a lot of complexity as well, mass, in terms of just making sure that you can have a deployable solar panel, for example, or that you get dust on that solar panel, it could interfere with its efficiency. So having wireless power kind of reduces the risk of a lot of those different challenges that we're discussing right now.
Well, since you did just jump into it a little bit there, and you talked about the crux of a lot of your things were wireless charging. What's different in the wireless charging environment rather than the pad I just put my iPhone on and get it charged overnight? Sometimes it doesn't charge. So what is different? How do you get the capacity that you need? And if you get the capacity you need, what about EM pollution?
Yeah, that's a great question, and great questions. And we're going to be investigating a lot of those through our tipping point contract. We're going to be characterizing the EM fields of the chargers to understand how they affect the lander, how they affect the different rovers. We don't quite know yet. And that's an interesting study that we're going to figure out. I can say that the chargers right now that we're developing are 85% efficient. We think we can get them to 90% efficient. So in a lot of ways, we think they could be more efficient than what we typically use here in a lot of cases. And I think that the biggest challenge is the environmental concerns is just how do you have something that can survive in the really intense thermal environments, the cislunar transit, when you're actually on the moon? How do you not be concerned about dust interacting and getting inside those devices and causing arcing or breaking any components? And there's a lot of things like even just in terms of the software and having the ability that the system can operate at its max temperatures and allowing it to kind of temperature throttle. There's different software techniques that we're using in these chargers versus what our partner Wybotic uses in commercial chargers that are deployed terrestrially. So yeah, I think when it really comes down to it, it's environmental challenges. That's the biggest difference for these.
All right, a question for Joe. You talked about you guys doing some battery work with Sierra Nevada and other things. Brings me back to my power tools. My power tool does not die, my battery dies.
Yes.
My battery connections die. My charger destroys the batteries or goes defunct. What kind of things are being looked at to improve the reliability of those components in any of these systems that are talking about change out of batteries or battery packs and those kinds of things?
Sure, that's a great question. So one of the things that we have done in terms of the design of the batteries for the space station, and we're applying that to these other vehicles that we're working with now too, all of those are in a human-rated environment. And that's something we didn't bring up earlier about these power systems. I assume that since we're working with the astronauts on the rovers, whether that's pressurized or the LTV, we're providing power to the HABs. All of these things are going to be in a human-rated environment. And so safety is really, really important. Lithium-ion batteries don't have the best track record when it comes to safety, as some of you know and remember from airliner issues. And you hear that every so often where there's a fire related to batteries. So one of the things we've done is design the charging system and the housing of the batteries, the thermal design of those things for the cells themselves can really go a long way toward maintaining a very safe battery system. And that is, I think, the paramount thing that we're focused on for these kind of missions. In terms of the cells themselves, I think the technology is improving. I am as frustrated as you by batteries in all my devices. But I am noticing now, as I get to the newer generation phones, I think that they're getting better. And obviously, some of that is, the way in which you do charge-discharge cycles and things like that. But that's part of the owner's manual that we have to provide to make sure that we get the best battery life.
All right, last question. I don't think anybody talked about it, but it's a big scale architecture question, and I'm going to point it at Christine. If we have enough power to go off and create hydrogen, oxygen fuel for launch vehicles, and we're creating things in that kind of quantity, then where do fuel cells come into the architectures, and using fuel cells as a method of using portable power as opposed to batteries?
Yeah, I think that's a good question, and I think that it can that they can be incorporated into the architecture going forward.
Well, that's a nice brief answer. Anybody else?
Yeah.
That's great. It's part of that overall portfolio.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
Peace yet to come. Well, we're about 30 seconds before my clock kicks out, so I'm going to thank all you guys and ladies for bringing us an interesting discussion. It's went in areas I didn't think that it would, and that's very good too. It's always good to cause us to think of different things and different ways of doing them. So Walt and panelists, thank you so much. So now it's time to go right into our next session to talk about potentially better ways to get to these surfaces we want to explore. So go to your agenda and click to your next agenda on Roadmap to Nuclear Space, Challenges for Propulsion. Panel, thank you very much. Audience, thank you.